everyone. Thanks for coming. It's amazing how many people are here. I'm really nervous and excited at the same time. And I want to send my condolences to the Nerman family. And it's really special to be here, to be in this museum. And thanks to Bruce and Hema and Whitney for helping me make sure to get everything here and everything. My work downstairs is the works that are monochrome with like the fishing lures on them. And I just was going to go over that work a little bit about myself and everything too. And I brought some notes. So I grew up nearby here and went to Shawnee Mission South High School, and I loved it. I loved my art classes. I guess you did too. And it was so supportive and encouraging. I studied photography when I went to undergrad in Milwaukee. And after school, kind of with limited resources, I was drawn to making images through painting. I don't have technical or formal training as a painter, so aspects of painting became interesting to me that weren't only on the canvas, but the culture and theory surrounding it, and essentially making it what it is today, and a lot of people are approaching that. I've always been attracted to simple, modern, abstract art, and it's pretty obvious, as most people are, and I'm curious and skeptical of it too. It's a ubiquitous thing now, and how the look of it or the vibe of it is nearly everywhere in the world and in popular culture, and particularly design and advertising and the way companies and corporations use it. So I was really interested in this dynamic of how it informs painting now and vice versa. I moved to Chicago for a couple years and just worked on paintings and indulged myself in the art world there, which was so much fun. I met some amazing people who are supportive and challenged and continue to push my interest in painting. I decided to apply to grad school at the affordable and very down-to-earth University of Illinois, Chicago. It's a heavy studio-based program and also a really great theory program. And it was great to just indulge in all of this painting and take it a lot more seriously for myself and discover my interests better here. So when I was in Chicago, I had studied photography, so I was working with a commercial photographer there, and while on those shoots, we would always go fishing. He loved doing that. Neither of us were really good at it necessarily, but it was just a kind of traveling around Illinois and just all these lakes and funny rural places to chill out at. It was kind of nice. So he was great and so much fun to work with. And actually, a friend of mine, Jeff Eaton, that's here also knows of this guy. So, but it was great he made time for us to do that. And so working with him really excited me because it exposed me to all the ins and outs and the behind the scenes of how extensive and seemingly meaningless commercials and ads can be despite how much power is around them. It helped me manage an interest in the effects of advertising on us and explore the strange relationship we have with it. Particularly powerful, ubiquitous imagery that was simple and consumable and highly effective for a capital gain. As an image maker, I was drawn to these types of images because of their incredibly staged and contrived representations on the photo shoots. These images inundate us and drill us with information. I was interested in how generic and stereotypical and stock-like these images were, like many people in photography now, and how this thinking is a really strong critique and how they are able, and this thinking is a really strong critique in how they are able to accrue a large amount of obtuse meanings through these images. So one day when we were fishing on the boat with not much luck, we were just digging through the lures and spacing out after losing a bunch, and it just clicked in a fun way that these were these little paintings for fish. And so particularly the spoon lures, more like these ones, which historically have just been made by breaking the end of a spoon off and putting a hole in it for that and a hook. And so in the water, it just has this more performative activity that imitates or mimics an injured game fish with the shininess on it, or like a bait. So I really liked that in a modern way, that it just outmodes nature and just sort of becomes the unnatural bait that can just outmode and last longer than that. So the spoon lure is one that I use, and also for its ubiquity, and then these fly lures that are pretty animated that I like to use. How many of the flies just use a very literal, many of the people that do this will just kind of find local bugs and seasonal insects that obviously the fish are working with at the time, and they'll bring them home and copy them. And so in Chicago and around Illinois, I'd met a few people that did this, some older men, and just was really excited about that, and just never did them myself, but was interested in crewing these other ones that were seemingly generic, but, really well handcrafted, but, strived for this sort of like kind of manufactured feel. So it was fun to be able to go to some of these lure factories and see these people work and produce this type of thing. But overall, I just really like, it's interesting to me, the hyper-real version of nature that these are, and that really interested me, and so many, and how many of the things in the world were like this at that moment. I became drawn to the idea of how we're always replacing the real with a surrogate, and how something else stands into the real and pretty much outmodes it now, and only offers us hyper-real steroided version of that. I was really interested in the relationship I was having with nature, with the fish at that moment, and the humor of the mechanisms involved in reaching them and interacting with them. So these devices became this interesting extension of us, and that interested me. Here's another installation of them, of a show that I did in London with them. And then also in this show, and in many of the shows, most all the shows I do, I'll repaint all the walls just as a sort of simple formal activity, more of a simple everyday painting, and just fun meditative process to just get in the space and feel good there. And but when I repaint them, I'll mix essential oils into them, or imitative perfume oils. So it's kind of, again, trying to emphasize that element of this real, or the imitation, and the different effects or affects they have. So throughout the exhibition, it slowly just evaporates through the paint and out of the space, and so by the end of it, it's kind of just back to just a odd yellow wall in there. While I was in Chicago, I also became attracted to these sign paintings that were everywhere. And more than any other city I've been in, just every corner store, bodega, and grocery store has them. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with them, and obviously they're in many cities. But I love how they held true to a classic and handmade technique of advertising that's slowly being replaced. So when I was in Chicago, I would go to these stores after shopping there and just try to figure out who was painting these, because they had an incredible anonymous quality to them. But it was also another thing that was very specific at the same time, because each person that did these, it was similar colors and obviously similar endeavors, but they all had their own little technique to it. It was really neat. So I worked with 4 or 5 of these guys, and it was really exciting tracking them down, and that was a part of the process. And after meeting with a few of them different times and just feeling out their interest in that, I began working with 2 particularly that were fun. So I would design things by using mini motifs that they used that were very simple and clip art-like. And I just liked the humor of the parallel to modern art again there. And then these works, I would, they're not necessarily their signs that are typical of that, but sort of my interest in using their marks and having them execute it, so hiring them to paint them. And oftentimes they have a very vacant feel, which I think is kind of a fun and almost sometimes a trendy look. And I like that achieved that by just removing language or the sale or the 59-cent bananas part, and just left it kind of like an interesting naked stage for those really awesome motifs just to like do their thing without that. Another body of work I was making there was these blue paintings. And it started out, I was really interested in using this like classic motif of of these dashed lines, and I really wanted to find a way to make something that could use that in a painting. So that it's a common architectural rendering as well as a cartoon and comic that represents the window. And I love that this mark presents an interesting boundary or limit on that literal and visual access of that space. So these are made with a chroma key blue paint, which you can get at like film and theater companies, and it's a little outdated now, but it's commonly like a green screen is what's more common now, and that I think is more compatible with like digital equipment. So the film worked really well with the blue, and I wanted them to feel like windows or almost like a store-like space in their installation. And And it's funny, but it just makes sense how galleries never have windows because there's spaces, real estate in another way. So I wanted to create the feeling of a commercial store type space with sort of a false, way out visually as a fun nod towards the commercial gallery. But also in this work, I love how this idea that paintings need people to make them happen. So I love the idea of also historically in minimal and modern art, this idea of the aura, despite whether it is real or not, as a social phenomenon in front of an artwork like a Rothko. So this has been a strong idea in abstract minimalism and is challenged beautifully by postmodern thinking later. But I love this work's relationship to the viewer. It needs people to be in front of it to allow it to become a backdrop that it is and only is. So it needs something to differentiate itself from the blue. So I never really use figure in my work, but I feel it has such a role in allowing the work to occur. I also like that at this point, I like that this paint or these paintings also need a camera to play a role as the middleman, to document the situation and allow for it to be better manipulated later in post-production on the computer. I'm interested in how many artists today are critiquing this information age and empowering people with an understanding and methods and algorithms that are oftentimes simplifying and commodifying our experience with things. I wanted to create an analog type of work that was familiar to painting, as well as a work that would consider its digital inclination. Growing up in the Midwest, I oftentimes experienced paintings in books or later on the internet, so many times that was the way I looked at paintings if I ever saw the other ones in real life. I also like the color. I like the color. It's an interesting color. I heard this podcast once that was talking about how the color blue is least likely found in our complexion. And so and obviously that's the reason why they were interested in using it. So to me, there's kind of an interesting relationship, almost, funny decoy monochromes that offer a motif that exaggerates that further. But I love the allusion to sky and this seemingly open and infinite space it has, while almost disguising themselves as that monochrome. And I just hope the work, people are able to look, at them and through them in that modern way and feel an optimism of that instead of picturing nothing, which they also can be. Here is another different version of them. So the last work I'd like to talk about is the newer stuff that I'm making right now that I just had a chance to show at the Kimrick Gallery in Berlin. And I started making these paintings kind of inspired by the lures I had originally been using, and sort of using their simple designs and motifs as a jumping off point to sort of create my own versions of those and then copy some as well. So they're done in segments and then sort of compiled together. They use a day glow paint, which is pretty, also somewhat of a corporate type paint. I'm always interested in these paints like the blue paint or the lures that oftentimes have this, function to them or offer a utility, but at the same time have some element of sort of pleasure in the visual realm. And Dayglow is interesting to me. There's like Frank Stella, Peter Halley, a lot of these other postmodern painters have been using it, so I like that familiarity there for it. And so these are all sort of made all at once, sort of quickly, or at least the look of being done quickly, like I usually try to have in a lot of the things I make. And so they're just a wet-to-wet type painting, sort of very simple, elementary almost, and just dripping the paints with waters. And it's a sort of a playful, simple relationship they have, and when the water dries and evaporates, it's kind of just captures a nice, freezes them there. And I like the Dayglow paint, not only for its relationship to the lures and how it's used there, but Dayglow also specializes in working with companies and corporations to create sort of colors or schemes or hyper-real colors for them in their endeavors. I don't know how long I've been up here, but it feels like half an hour, but probably it's just good. But I'd be glad to, if there is extra time, I'd be glad to, if anybody has any questions or anything like that, I'd do that. And then here's a couple other sign paintings, a little more literal one that has the text removed. But if there's any other, or if there's any other, since there was none, any questions, that should probably be it then. Cool, thanks everyone.
Hey, thank you all for coming. There's a lot of people here. Thank you so much. My name is Chris Daharsh. Like Bruce said, from Omaha, Nebraska. I'm in Kansas City, or I'm related to Kansas City through the Art Institute, went there and graduated in 2012. And now I live and work in the New York City area. So I'm going to, if I may, sort of paint my work with a broad brush and sort of give you the premise for the work that you see downstairs. I did the like craggy plaster and dye paintings that are on stilts that are sort of like versions of a Hollywood sign in a certain way. So yeah, I'm going to bring you back to when I was a young adult, a series of photographs that I made when I was in China in 2007. And I was really trying to document textures and patinas I found that I saw as being really interesting at the time. I didn't really have a connection for why I was interested in them, but I eventually wanted to be making paintings out of these photographs. So they were for that purpose. But later on, I sort of realized that they were analogous with these textures and patterns and patinas that I found in the Midwestern environment back home. In industrial zones like grain elevators, old train yards, rusty tracks, things like that, things that were sort of off limits. So yeah, this is one of the photographs from that series in China. And this was a furnace outside of a temple in Hong Kong where people would write down their prayer and burn it in this furnace. And I really liked the connection here, the direct connection I saw between the texture of the patina of the burnt, charred brick and the action of burning a piece of paper. I really liked that direct connection. I saw it sort of as an implication of an action, that it contained, that patina somehow contained a memory, an index of prayer in a certain way. This was the final photograph I'm going to show from that series. It was interesting, I somehow had to travel across the world to see these things in a different way and bring back these perspectives to the Midwest and appreciate my surroundings in a new way. And it really conditioned my eyes to see my environment and my surroundings as vessels for time and memory. So this is an early piece that sort of addressed these things in a sculptural way. Like I said, I made a bunch of paintings from those photographs, but I was taken with sculpture's ability to interact with the human body, and it relates to the human body, or it interferes with the human body in certain ways. You have to walk around it. You have to see the other side. It is an impediment somehow. But in that way, you sort of slow down and look at it in a different way. And I like to think of this one as sort of a barrier or a remnant of an action that had happened, a still after the action. And this is a T-shirt that I dipped in concrete and laid over steel rebar. It sort of has this weird like tie-dye effect too, but it's concrete, so it's not. It's sort of the opposite of tie-dye for some reason. This is another piece from around that time period called Improvisational Barrier from 2013. And I was continuing to be interested in moving into the viewer's space and interpreting forms, and through that, sort of interpreting forms that I found in the man-made environment, such as barriers, street scenes, construction sites, facades, things like that. And I really enjoyed, particularly at this time, and still do, trying to focus on the attempt to represent something, and attempting to represent a barrier somehow makes it its own object. It becomes its own thing. It's sort of falling short of that representation, but I like that it does that. And this was when I also started making, or started formulating the process for making plaster panels, much like the ones that you see downstairs, but this one's a little shorter. So this is a little bit of an aside, but still involving the dyeing process and using plaster as a sculptural material. For this particular guy, I was really looking at like a lot of props of relics in movies and sort of how to represent a prop, sort of indirectly thinking about that scene in Indiana Jones when he switches the relic with a bag of sand, and like how that's a representation of a prop, or I'm sorry, of a relic. It's a prop. So this is my prop of a prop. It's a representation of a representation. And I like that it sort of like falls in that area where it is again like this attempt at representing something. And I also, at this time, sort of introduced this way of presenting objects in situations where the presentation was a reference to its making. So the pedestal here is a block of foam instead of wooden. So it references that this sculpture has foam inside it. It has, it's somewhat a representation of a pedestal as well. These are two shots from a piece called Prop, this really small piece. It's like a tabletop piece. But this is when I was beginning to work with this process of using plaster and dye on panels, specifically in like a flat, two-dimensional sculptural way. And I was really, really interested in the back of this thing, and the backs of objects always have interested me, the delineation between the back and the front, and allowing the viewer to see both sides. There's something really nice about being able to see the back of something and then returning to the front of it with a new perspective. So I was interested in that with this one. And I enjoyed at this time thinking about these things like things that I found in the man-made environment, such as billboards, signs, facades, walls, things that had like a definite facade and then a support structure in the back that you weren't really supposed to pay attention to. This is a piece called Irmpov, which is a play on the word improv. It's sort of like a failed title in and of itself. But this is an improvisational piece that I attempted to contain every single element of my studio inside of it. And so at the time, I was doing, like you can see in the picture, there are a lot of different elements that I was using, like woodworking, these plaster panels, dyes, transparencies, photography, image making, and like that dangling plant that I dipped in plaster to sort of cement it in time to capture its essence. And this sort of became a site map for my studio. And yeah, I really enjoyed in this piece, it has its own sense of logic in that it is a failure of itself, but I like showing the failure. I like showing the failed piece. I find that very funny. So that sort of moves us up to near present with my work. This is the last show that I had at Ha Contemporary with my friend Molly Kadirka. And this was called What Remains. And we both sort of approached the theme of artifact from different areas. I approached it from like me trying to use my process in my studio to make my own artifacts, like artifacts of the studio. And she sort of approached it from the arena of science and observation, sort of like observing these artifacts and recording them through drawing. She had a series of drawings in this show that were drawings of stars, drawings of artifacts, man-made and geological. And yeah, this is when my studio process really started to slow down a lot, which was really nice. I started to make works serially, so I used the same format in this show for all the works. There was 5 works that were all the same format. So I was maintaining a constant that I could throw variables at. These were 2 pieces from that show. The one on the left is Grace Prop, and the one on the right is Blank Prop. And especially for this show, but with a lot of my work that deals with color, I was thinking about how in traditional modernist ways, color can connote something that's overly emotional, something that's feminine, and something that's primal, like this primal state. And I like to take these biases and these sort of preconceived notions of color and reintroduce them to modern forms, like the modernist, rectangle, cube, square, the hard edges. And yeah, through literally like bathing them in color over and over again with this dye, I like to think that I'm transforming them and making them my own. This is another view from those 2 guys, the side and back view. Just to give you an idea of scale, these are 6 feet tall and 3 feet wide, so a little bit shorter than the ones that are downstairs. And they're made of hydrostone plaster, which is a little bit stronger than plaster of Paris, and burlap, dye, poplar, and various hardwares. The one on the left here is the first one that I made in this series called Grief Prop. And especially with this one, I liked looking at objects and artifacts like burial shrouds, tablets, ancient monuments, and specifically also the monolith from 2001: Space Odyssey that sort of comes down from heaven and introduces technology and violence to apes, which is really mysterious, and I like to like grab onto that air of mystery with these. This is the final piece I'm going to show from that show. This is called Fester Prop, and I really liked to think of this and still do process of dyeing as a form of meditation to really slow down my studio process and have this thing that I can go to that is sort of mechanical, even though I'm thinking about the next move. It becomes a ritual for my studio to really slow down and think about the next step. Oh, and that one took the most amount of dyeing, and I think it took me about 3 weeks to do, so the dyeing process is the longest, really, for these. And this is currently what's in my studio, just to give you a little briefing. This is, on the right, a mold, a silicone mold, and then on the left is the original. And so I'm experimenting and making multiples. The original is made with wood, foam, and plexiglass. And so, yeah, I'm thinking about now how to limit the variables to introduce into my studio to make it more specific. Yeah, these are some of the casts that I've done so far. So I'm experimenting in like different casting materials, but also different ways of dyeing. I'm experimenting with different plasters and resins, different dyes, things like that. And in this way, sort of moving a little bit closer to painting with these. But I still want to stay in touch with the aspects of object making that got me interested in sculpture in the first place. Creating records of time through process, and sort of making these vessels of memory. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you all for coming tonight. This is an amazing crowd. That's me. Bringing this up as a slide is important, I feel, because I spent the last nearly 6 years here, and the last almost 2 years at the drugstore. And I've been very, I guess, concentrating on just making work since graduating in 2014. With the drugstore, it's just a group of artists, and we're there, and so the community there, we were just getting acquainted with each other, and I felt like I just started getting going, and then I just recently moved, so temporarily. But, so the first work I'm gonna show you was made here in June, and that's the oldest piece in the show downstairs. And I'm just gonna focus on the work that's in the show. So, the strength of a brown soil. A lot of things were going through my mind, and this was after the election, and I bring that up to tie it in with the actual curatorial idea behind the show. Subconsciously, I guess it was presenting itself into the body of the work. And the ideas upon this painting was just basically people of color. I was looking at the election as a time for people of color to come together and become stronger together as opposed to being somewhat divided. And all that depends on where somebody was growing up. So in South Texas, in San Antonio, I'm thinking, there we go. Can you hear me still? Like that? Okay, good. Okay. Growing up, it was always stories that I've heard from my folks and my dad especially about it's hard to get Latinos to work together to achieve something for the greater good. Fast forward to the Trump era, this work was important because I was trying to look at the beauty of people of color as coming together in a world that's starting to be just divided very much so and angry. So this work, just concentrating on trying to display the beauty of what it means to be brown and earth nourishment, and that gives growth into new things in life. And at the same time, what's been a motif in my work is land and owning land and stories pertaining to family members owning land and my immediate family not. So those are all these ideas that were involved in this time. Slow plan, all the work usually just comes from an active narrative, and sometimes it starts just, laying paint down. It's not necessarily the narrative is not there. It becomes there. It reveals itself to you. And in the slow plan, it was just a night. This is the most recent one in November. And time-wise, I feel it's kind of relevant because of the show. And so this process was just me just laying down paint, enamel paint, laying down white, and just going. Then a trip to a doctor, actually. You know how we all have those appointments, and they might not tell us what we want to hear. So coming back to the studio, it was just a matter of, getting my hand to this canvas, and it just came from there. So that's, sometimes it just happens really quickly, even though the process begins kind of slow. And I guess a slow plan kind of just leads the viewer to what that narrative might be. So that was the last piece that was finished here. And then I moved, so very recently, December 1st, I went back to San Antonio. And so these works are all from that time in San Antonio. So at the same time, you know, I didn't have a studio, and so I was just reading a lot, writing a lot, you know, looking into what owning land means. And you know, it sounds easy enough, you know, there's nothing special about what that means. But in terms of land, heirloom, the act of exchange, and then the act of keeping that land or that heirloom within the family, that's what I was interested in. And how vital it is for owning land, and that sets the pavement for the future of your families, your children and their children. And then the dynamic of keeping it in the family is very important. So, you know, I didn't have a studio yet. I was just reading and just drawing a lot. And, you know, these ideas are not unheard of, but it's when there's barriers, financial barriers, or, you know, I mean, economic barriers. When that gets in the way, those simple items become luxuries. So this one, just basically kind of a statement about having the possibility and having land, but actually having the idea of trying to protect that land and protect that hope for that future, and for that narrative to become something that can be handed down. The need for myself to have something tangible to hand down to the next generation becomes very personal to me, because we do not have heirlooms. Like we have very little of that, you know, to hand down. We don't have land, so it's like these narratives is all that we have. So it's a translation of those narratives into paintings that they're set as objects. So these objects become the land, in a sense, to hand down. So, and next one. So hospital drawings. I'm going to show you what's these drawings. There are 2 out of the 9 that I made one night. Basically, I didn't know at the time, but these were going to be set in my memory when the new painting was coming about. So, you know, it's just, I'm in the hospital, it's 3 a.m., I can't sleep. I asked the nurse for some paper and a pencil, and actually a marker, and she's like, it gives me a little nub of a pencil and no eraser. And so, you know, it's plain copy paper, you know, but it's just a need to put something down on the surface. So, you know, just simple line drawings. And when I'm making the work, drawings or not, they might be repeated again and again, but it's never a goal to actually look at the first and the next one and copy it over. It's always the memory of those originals. And so here I'm thinking about, you know, growing up as a child, things that resemble limbs, speaking about health. In the middle section, you know, hindsight, you know, looking backwards, kind of reminded me of Catholic school where I went, kind of like the Virgin Mary. And it's crazy because I didn't see it at the time, but then looking back at it, I see it. I was like, well, that's interesting, you know, because I haven't been to a Catholic church in the 90s or something. So but you know, your memories remain, well, as we hope, right? So those two drawings become very important because when I was creating this new body of work, I just had no idea what I was going to make at the time, and I'm sure, I mean, you just feel it, you know, you're prepping the surface, you're putting it up, and so if you got the money, honey, just came out, and it was a very fast painting. And so several of the motifs pop up, some new ones pop up, but it's still, you know, and you can see the influence of those hospital drawings in this painting. And so it revealed itself to me, it told me where it needed to go. So this was a very fast-paced painting. But you can see the, you know, definitely the shift in color was definitely, I guess, affected by the room in which I painted. Plus, I was in San Antonio again, and so there was a lot of light coming from the left side of the space. And the color palette, like, I did notice the shift in that. But yeah. Secondary succession. You know, this is just an idea I had about new growth after a fire. You know, there's always new growth and lusciousness that comes after anything like that. So that's what I was thinking about, new growth as far as obstacles and pushing against those obstacles, and so the in-between. The need to create these works, though, it's from that idea of ownership. So that's the main thing I wanted to stress on that. And I think it sets well with this body, with the work and the show, is because of that tension between, you know, having that anger maybe some of us have with the Trump era. But somebody asked me about, is that something that's important in the work? And it's not. It might be to some other people. I mean, for me, it's just like, it's not political to me, it's just life to me. So it's just, being an artist of color, you have to deal with certain things, and your stories are different from those that see it from the outside looking in, and vice versa. But yeah, I don't know if anybody has any questions. That would be awesome. But that's what I was thinking about. Oh, I got one more slide. I'm sorry. So I never stopped working. Everybody knows me, some of those who know me here. So the new work that I was really excited about, it's already gotten me going for the newer work coming. I don't see myself going, at least not wanting to go smaller. I would like to continue the size that is downstairs or larger. But, you know, the motifs are shifting here and there. The narrative is still there. It just, and I'm anxious to see what actually living in San Antonio again will do to the work. And this next one, you can see like the influence of some of the work downstairs, especially the newer, the larger scale one, the yellow one. And but yeah, thank you for coming.
Hi, everybody. Just want to quickly thank Bruce Hartman for the opportunity to be part of this exhibition here. Thank the fellow artists involved with it. It's just been fun to see the show come together. I was here in February, installed my piece, and not many of the other works were up then. So it was a real treat to come back and see everything together. Also thanks to Whitney and Hema and Art and just the rest of the group here who made everything so easy, and also to Alice Thorson for her thoughtful writing. And also want to thank my mom and dad for letting me crash while I'm staying here. So, all right. They even let me have my own bedroom. So, all right. So this is my piece. It's entitled 8.25 Minutes, and it's from 2017. This is the second place it's existed. The first was in an exhibition at the Knoxville Museum of Art in 2017. Okay. So I'm going to quickly fly through a little bit of where I've been and sort of bring you, hopefully tie some things together where this work came from. And so I'm going to also fly through some images as well. This is perhaps the stupidest painting I've ever made, okay? But I think you will all be familiar. Oh, it's not showing up. I was going to pull the cursor on top of it. It is. Oh, there's that little guy. All right. So we're familiar with that. I'll just leave him up there for a while. Oh, no, he's just off the page. Sorry. So we're familiar with that. That's our way of moving around that digital space and saying, will you be my friend? Ooh, I really like that photo you took. These are the shoes that I'd really like to buy. I need to put that on my wish list. I need some more information about that. If I just keep searching, I'm going to find some more. So we're always reaching out there, and now we even do it on these things, on our tablets, all that. So we're always like looking for something, sort of longing for something. And much of my work, as I think back about it, has been about that sort of attempt to tie or sort of find these things that we're looking for or wanting. And I've thought about this in terms of what do we do as humans? We make things, we mark things, we design things. You're sitting in a chair that somebody designed. You might walk out through downtown Kansas City and find some graffiti. That's somebody's way of saying, I was here, I existed, I did something. And so we're surrounded by those things, and they all have intention to them. Some of my work pulls from a variety of things. It tends towards abstraction, but there's times where I'll find something that's in a photographic form, or something that's even more sort of like a symbol, like a sort of moon and a mountain juxtaposed against each other. So not photographic, but more something you find on a cave wall or something like that. The sense of touch is really important for me. That something has a haptic sense to it, that you can feel the sort of crumbliness of it or something like that. I saw Stalker earlier this year, and my phone went off in the very last minute of the movie. Not a proud moment for me, but against that sense of like touch and sort of handling of something that it's existed in the world is important. This is a group of paintings that I hung together at a show in 2013, and it gives you a little bit of sense of what might be going on in my studio and how those things might come together. So in the past, there's not always been a sort of one single way of making a painting, but maybe there are lots of questions that I'm putting out there, and not knowing the answers for them, but just sort of trying to find out what's going on, try and work through my feelings, my thoughts, in that world around me. I was really lucky in 2013 to spend some time in Marfa, Texas, at a place called the Chinati Foundation. It was founded by the sculptor Donald Judd. I had a residency there for 2 months, and during those 2 months, I went around, I photographed the town. I saw amazing sort of like cobbled together architecture like this. But I might walk the next street over and see some architect from New York or LA who had designed a magnificent home as well. So there's just like a whole lots of things I was encountering there. But I was also really taken with the light that I was seeing there. I thought I could see the colors more truly, but also I would be blinded by the light as well. So this is a painting that I made while I was there, and I was thinking about something like viewing like the sort of warmth of a hearth, a fire, but what does that feel like, or what does it look like if you were watching it on the cold blue of a television screen? So it's just sort of putting these sort of propositions out there and sort of following them through to see what they would reveal. But again, every day it was just really affected by the amount of light I was experiencing there, and how you would stare at something at midday and it would just sort of burn itself into your eyes, whether it was looking at a fence post or the side of a brick building or whatever it might be. You'd look away and you'd still continue to see that. While I was there, I also started investigating this image. And I think we can all understand the pull of these images of nature that we encounter. This one had personal meaning for me because it had been the stock photo that was on my parents' photo album when I was a child. We can understand that sentiment of, like, here's a family of birds. It's the same way that we see, we might have a photograph of a sunset on a refrigerator or maybe on our desktop. Or maybe a floral pattern on our walls. We want to, even when we're inside, when we're away from nature, we want to be tied back to it. So I started taking this image, not really knowing what I was going to do with it, and started sort of taking it apart and reassembling it. Here's me sort of drawing in the studio using inkjet for the color and a Xerox machine for the black and white. But I continued to make these drawings, sort of cutting and pasting and reassembling them. And then I started working on these paintings. They're about 11 inches by 8 inches, about the sort of size of a head or mask of the face. And I wanted to keep pulling that sense of the light that I was experiencing in West Texas while I had been at the Chinati Foundation, and allow that, and again, they're almost like tablet size too. But allow the paintings to have this sort of DNA of that original image of those gulls, those birds, but also exist like an after image, as if we've stared too long at the light. And so I made quite a few of these small ones, sort of sitting in the back room of my studio over the fall of 2013. And I was working on them all at the same time. But I thought of them as all coming from the same place, but then seeing this really dramatic, sort of diverse outcomes from them. Here you can see a sort of wall of them hung together, all coming from that one single source. Also sort of boosted up that image and started making some larger versions of it. I thought it would make like one painting based off of that image, but it just like kept sort of giving more and more images. And so this is the last one of that I'll show. And I just want to bring us back to this for a second. I think most of us have had an experience of sitting around a campfire, or maybe you've got a fire pit near your house or something like that. But there's that sort of moment where maybe you're there with others, maybe somebody's telling a story, or maybe you're there by yourself and you just sort of get lost and sort of stare in the fire, that sort of flickering light. And so that idea of the sort of things that glow, that emanate light, was really sort of weighing on me and sort of affecting how I was thinking about color as an artist. We look at the moon, we look at our tablets, we look at our phones, those things that emanate light. They hold us captive, okay? Here's an image of a flower that I used in some additional paintings. It's sort of alien-looking passion flower. There's those gulls again. And I'd made all these tiny paintings, and I felt like I needed to change the scope of the work. And so I started working on this painting, which is 8 feet by 20 feet. You can see on one side the gull image is sort of tilted over and actually sort of laying on its side. And on the other side is that image of the passion flower, which is, you think of a flower as sort of a compact thing, but it's also sort of exploding outward there. So I think I wanted to tie into almost this sort of sublime feeling. You're sort of using these natural things, using that, what I sort of approximate as the glow of a digital screen, but also sort of something that begins to wrap its arms or sort of be bigger than the viewer. So it's like the only way to view it is to be 30 feet back from it, or to be in it and really sort of scanning it as you walk past it, viewing it in motion. Another image with those birds, it's like they really become sort of like decompressed and begin to float away. The sort of image becomes unmoored. And so, you know, like a memory we're trying to hold on to, like Cristina talked about, there's these moments where like the memory also feels like it's sort of drifting away, or you can't quite hold on to it. You know, asking again questions of myself, what's it like to be watching the dying embers of a fire, but watching it on my computer screen? Or is it like flying over Los Angeles at 30,000 feet? You know, there's a sort of commonality there. So some of those things are things floating around in my studio and how I've been thinking about my work. That brings me here to 8.25 minutes, which is the time it takes light to travel from the sun to the earth. When I started thinking, I didn't know that title when I started working on it, but it's what I arrived at. In my studio, I had lots of different things I was looking at. I had found this book about Pompeii and was really intrigued by these domestic spaces that were just filled with images, paintings on the walls, mosaics, and then also that they're preserved because that town, that city was destroyed. So our benefit, do we get to see these things because they're buried as they were, but also the sort of destruction tied to that as well. And often so many of these interior spaces had images of nature in them. Again, that's something that we keep coming back to. Another thing that I was thinking about would be something like Philip Johnson's Glass House. What a magnificent piece of architecture to be in there and to look out and sort of have the world just at that arm's length, always sort of there. But then as I thought about it, it's like, would I really want to live there? Aside from jokes about throwing stones and where you might use the bathroom, you know, would you really, it's nice to be there, but would you really want to live there? And so there was both a sort of joy at that place, but also like, I don't know. You know, I like the theory. I'm not sure if I could handle it. Other things, I was floating around my studio thinking of water lines, whether it's something like this, which is more sort of geographic striations of where the water has been, or something like a scenario where you see the homes after Katrina, where you have the level of the water slowly going down in them. Or even something like the inkjet print from your computer where you're running out of ink, sort of coming out of it. So these were some of the feelings, the sources, the sort of wellstones that I was looking at as I was beginning to craft these paintings for the installation. Maybe showing you too much behind the scenes. This is one of the source photographs that I was using. I was in a museum in Miami taking a break from looking at the art. I looked out the window towards the garden, so there's all this lush foliage and bamboo and things like that. But there's also my reflection and these reflections of the walls and the fluorescent lights of the space that I'm in. And it's all sandwiched right there on that skin of that window. And again, it felt like this sort of space of the screen that we might touch and interact with. Show you just a few more of these. Have you seen them there? So even the color, wanting it to be like maybe that inkjet print, that luminosity of a screen, and it's in these sort of cyan, magenta, yellow, and black sort of colors. Just one or two little more things here. There, you might have noticed that there's these bits of paper on the back, and there's just these things that are floating around the studio as well. Emily Dickinson, on the little like scraps of paper she would compose on and sort of work out her poems, she referred to those as sort of gorgeous nothings. And I think of these little things on the back of the paintings as sort of my gorgeous nothings. That they, it's like they contain everything in them, and, but they're also sort of mysteries at the same time. If they weren't on the back of that painting, I'd hope that maybe if you saw them on a tabletop or on the floor, you might have to pick them up and sort of care for them or take care of them. So this is that installed last year. I'm bringing this to a close here. And what I'll do is, there's a poem that I've been really obsessed with over the last couple years, and so you'll have to excuse my voice, but listen to the words, okay? It's from Osip Mandelstam, a poet who lived and worked in Russia, and it's called "And I Was Alive." And I was alive in the blizzard of the blossoming pear. Myself I stood in the storm of the bird cherry tree, and all was leaf life and star shower, unerring and self-shattering power, and it was all aimed at me. What is this dire delight, flowering, fleeing, always earth? What is being, what is truth? Blossoms rupture and rapture the air, all hover and hammer, time intensified and time intolerable, sweetness raveling rot, it is now, it is not. So thank you very much, and thank you for letting me share that poem with you.